Hey everyone, in this video we are going to make a game like the old arcade game Scramble. It's a really great start to 2D game design, so let's begin. At the bottom we notice that there are 6 images. Nothing in particular to note about these images. They were simply drawn in an external paint program. You can use whatever you want. I used Anime Studio. I do want to mention something about the 2 landscape images, so let's drag and drop those into the scene. So this is the main environment. When I drew these images, I made sure that one side would match the other side for height. That lets you tile these on and on and on indefinitely. So if we take this image, we copy this, we paste this, and then we flip it horizontally. Do that over here in the inspector. For Sprite Renderer, you can flip X. This will, of course, line up with itself. And then you can take this first one again, copy it, paste it, likewise flip it, and just like that you can make an infinite level. Now this is only using 2 images, so the player will pick up on the pattern, but you can make 3, 4, 5 images, however many you want. The key is that the edges need to line up. So let's go ahead and place these together. Now since they are solid colors, then you don't have to line them up exactly right horizontally. You do have to take more care though if there is more of a pattern or if there's any kind of lighting. And now we will select all these with a shift click on the top and then, a click on the top and a shift click on the bottom. We'll select them all and then we'll just reposition this to like -2. And then we'll slide them all over. And this will be the beginning of the level. So what will happen is the landscape will auto scroll over, giving the illusion that you're flying over it. So how do we do that? We need to add a rigid body to the camera, and we're going to make the camera move. So let's go to Add Component, Physics 2D, Rigid Body 2D. Make sure to shut off gravity, because if you don't, the landscape will just drop because gravity will be pulling it down. We may use gravity scale for a few of the objects later, such as with the bombs that you drop, but we'll see. So now that this has a rigid body 2D, we can now add velocity to it. So right click, create, and let's call this, so it's a C# script. We'll call this game flow because I've got a feeling that we're going to use it for the overall gameplay. So we'll go to main camera, put game flow on it, and then open it up. You can delete the 2 lines that have the double // If you see a double // that means it's a remark statement, so it is not executed. It's purely internal documentation. We are first going to create a variable, which I'll explain why we need it in a minute. So this is going to be a public static float, and it will be called base speed, base velocity, and will sit at 1.5f. In the start section, we're going to issue a command that we want the camera to move at that speed. So get component, rigid body 2D, parentheses, velocity equals new vector 2. And it's a vector 2 because it's only the x and y coordinate. Since it's a 2D environment, we don't use z. And it will be base speed and 0. So it's going to move at 1.5 positive along the x-axis and not move at all on the y-axis. And let's run that. Just like that, you have the auto scroll, which is one of the biggest parts of the gameplay. As far as the actual speed, that is purely arbitrary. That's a game balance decision that you can make on your own. As you can see, we got to the end pretty quickly. So what we're going to do, Let's just add one more, but really doesn't have to be that long because this is for demonstrative purposes only. This isn't meant to be the full game. Because at a certain point when you develop in a game, it becomes rinse and repeat. So we'll unflip that, line those up, and now we just made it a little bit longer. Now let's add the ship. So we'll just take the ship image, put it into the scene. We'll have it start in the upper left corner. And just so you know, if you ever make an image and it turns out to be too small or too big, you might not have to redraw it, because if you need to change the size just a little bit, there's a couple ways you can do this. You can change the size of the original resource. So for instance, say I wanted the ship to be smaller, I could come up here to pixels per unit and increase the number. Yes, a bigger number makes it smaller. So say I made it 120, and we hit apply. I just shrunk it a little bit. You don't necessarily have to redraw images. Obviously, if you make a huge change, things will start looking pixelated, but you can certainly tweak things a little bit. So similarly, this needs to have a rigid body 2D. So add component, physics 2D, rigid body 2D. We'll also again get rid of gravity. If we didn't, then it would automatically drop towards the ground. It too needs a script telling it at what speed to move. So right-click, create C#, and we'll call this ship con because it's going to control the ship. You can call it whatever you want, player control. So we drag and drop the ship con script. We're going to open that up. Again, we're going to get rid of the remark statements. And in the start section, we're going to put in get component, rigid body 2D, again, we're changing the velocity, the vector 2. Now in this case, since it's a static variable and it's declared in a different script, we have to refer to that script. So we'd have to type in gameflow dot base speed. So in the other script, we could just type base speed because that was the script in which base speed was declared. Since this is a different script, we have to say where that variable is coming from. And it would only be accessible because it's static. We say that would be 0. And now the ship is moving along with the camera. And now you've created the illusion that the ship is flying. So why even do this? Why even have a variable if we're just going to have the same value used in both situations? Two reasons. One, by using a variable, you can increase the speed of the scroll. So for instance, maybe you're going to have a difficulty setting, and one of the ways to make it more difficult is the environment moves faster. So rather than having to go back and change that constant speed, changing a bunch of constants, you just change that one variable. So say you have a difficulty selector, you simply change this one variable, and every single place that variable occurs will change. So maybe you have a medium difficulty and it's a base speed of 3, and you have an advanced difficulty and a base speed of 5. You change that one variable, and then it applies it in all those different instances. The other reason, we're going to have a second variable, which is going to allow the ship to move somewhat independently. So you're going to have the ability to move the ship forward. So that means it's already in motion, but it needs to move even faster. So it's going to have a combined velocity of the base speed plus a speed on top of that. So how do we do that? Well, we need to add some key control. Now, with a game like this, you'd probably use an analog stick, but I'm just going to use the keyboard for now because it's easy to code, and very shortly, Unity is going to be changing the way the various inputs work, so I'd rather not delve into that if it's about to change. So what we're going to do, we go back to our shipcon script, and we need to see if the character is moving up and down, if the ship is moving up and down. So what we can do is if input. So input is being looked for from the player. And what we'll do is we'll do get key. So as long as this is true, this will continue to happen. So get key, and let's do W. Now what we're going to do, we will have to change this because right now that's a 0. We're going to have to replace that with yet another variable. So let's actually go ahead and do that. So within the shipcon script, we are going to do, this actually can be a private. I don't think it needs to be public, and it doesn't need to be static. We can always come back and change it to public and static if we need to. It's not engraving this in stone or anything. So private, and we'll also have this be a float, and we'll call this y vel for y velocity, and it defaults to 0. So now what we do, we copy this, we paste it here, and this will probably rewrite a little bit later to make it a little bit cleaner, but for now it works. So if we're moving up, then it needs to be a +1. Then we'll do else. We'll copy this partly out of laziness and partly to iterate that this is basically just rinse and repeat now. So if the key that's being pressed is S, so typical WASD control, then the base speed would be -1. Else, what we'll check to see is if neither key is being pressed, then I believe that's just an exclamation point in front of input. Exclamation point is basically how you say not in C#. So we need double ampersand. So in other words, we check to see, is W being pressed? Okay, if it's not, is S being pressed? Okay, if not, let's confirm that neither one are being pressed. So let's make sure we have enough parentheses. So the letter needs its own parentheses, the input needs its own parentheses, and then the entire if needs a parenthesis. So it looks like we need one more. Whoops. There we go. So it's messy to look at, but basically you just go from the inside out. You just make sure that you have all the proper parentheses that you need. So what we're going to do is let's say this is 0. So if W is being pressed, then +1 on the y velocity. If S is being pressed, -1 on the y velocity. If neither one is being pressed, then no velocity on the y-axis. I believe that should let us move the character up and down now. Yep. Like I said, we can always clean up the code later. That's the nature of game design, is you make it work, and then you go back and you optimize. So now what we need to do is we need to make the character move forward. So now let's go ahead and add the next variable. So private float x vel mod for modifier, and it's currently going to be 0. We're going to use addition as opposed to multiplication. So we're going to do for this, we're going to say if input dot get key, and continue to use WASD key control, we'll put in the letter D. So if D is being pressed, then we want something to happen. That new variable so x, there we go, xvel mod equals, let's make it like let's make it a solid 1. Now what we're going to do, we're going to undo some of this because, as I said, this was kind of temporary. What we want is we really only want one get component per turn. So what we do, we will take this and we just put it outside of an if statement. So in other words, it gets run once per frame because it's in the update section. This from base speed becomes base speed plus xvel mod. So now we're adding this to this, and we will use here, we created that yvel mod. So yvel. And now what we can do is we can just get rid of these. So yes, I could have jumped right to this, but again, I wanted to show you the logic first as far as what you're doing. So yvel would be equal to W, we said, would be a positive 1. S, we said, would be a negative 1. And then neither would be 0. And now you have just a single get component that makes all the changes. So similarly for here, else, we're going to check for the A key. Negative velocity, xvel mod will be equal to negative 1 at that point. And then for the final else, if neither is being pressed. So let's grab this one. And like I said, the entire if needs parentheses. And the ampersand separating them. So again, from the inside out, D has its parentheses. This input has its parentheses. A has its parentheses. Input has its parentheses. And then the whole thing has its parentheses. Now we add the exclamation point for not. So if this is not being pressed and this is not being pressed, then this needs to be 0. So if I haven't made any mistakes, let's go back to the scene. We'll run it. Moving right. Let go, it stops. Moving left. Now what you might want to do, it's your choice, this would be a game balance issue, is that as soon as you let go of the D, what you might want to do is you may want to temporarily add a negative velocity so you automatically drift on your own. That's purely game design. And then you can move up and down. So just like that, we have our control. We don't have our basic game control, I should say. We don't have the limit, so we're going to have to check either for position or maybe add a collider. So let's go ahead and put those controls into place. So we need to make sure the ship doesn't go out of bound vertically, at least up, to the left, or to the right. We don't have to worry about down because eventually we'll put in collision detection and that will take care of that. So we're just going to put in another check in our ship.conf script. We're going to say if the y vel, so the y velocity variable, if we set it equal to 1, and we have already reached a point that we don't want to go any higher, so we have to look at the transform component, the position attribute, and specifically the y value. If y is greater than, say, 4.3, whatever the top part is, wherever you have this positioned on your screen. So if the y position is greater than 4.3, then we don't want this to be applied. We don't want it to reach here. And so y vel will be set back to 0. So in other words, we're just unconditionally saying if you press W, then y velocity is set to 1. Here, we're doing a double check, say, okay, well, you set y velocity to 1, but the position is too high, and so we'll set this back to 0. Did I save that? Yes, there's no little asterisk there, which indicates it's not saved. So this should prevent us from going off the top of the screen. Sure enough, I'm hitting the key, and it won't go any higher. So controlling the limits for the x-axis is going to be a little bit more challenging because since you're always scrolling to the right, this limit is always increasing. So rather than looking at an absolute number like the y-coordinate, what we can do is we can compare it to the position of the camera. So the camera is dead center. It's at a 0x. The ship is at relatively -9. So it's 9 away from the camera. So what you can do is you can check for that difference. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to create another static variable so as that this can know where this is. So to do that, we go back to our game flow script and we add another public static. And this one will be vector2. And then what we'll do is in the update section, sorry, we got to name this, cam POS for position. And then we need to, with every frame, cam POS is equal to transform.position. And that is the position of the object the script is attached to, which is the camera. So now that we've created that static variable, this will now be accessible to the ship. So what we can do, we can say if x vel mod, if it's currently -1, equals to -1, so you're trying to move to the left, and transform dot position dot x minus game flow dot cam position dot x. So if one minus the other is less than -9, kind of crazy to look at. We'll review it in a second. And then in this case, x vel mod will be set back to 0. We need a parenthesis around the whole thing. So the position of x, if we're taking its position and we're minusing out the camera's position, if the difference is greater than -9, or excuse me, if it's less than -9, then we won't let it move any further to the left, and x vel mod will be set back to 0, which means the ship will continue to move at the base speed, which is synchronized with the speed of the camera. So let's hope I didn't do that wrong. There we go. It stopped. Absolutely perfect. So now you have your up, you have your left. Okay, so now it would just be a matter of doing the same thing for the right. If we move this over, so somewhere around, I'm not sure if you'd really want them to be able to go that far, but whatever. It looks like it would be just about +9 on the other side, which makes sense. So we just take this, again, partially out of laziness and partially to reiterate that we are simply rinsing and repeating at this point. So if xvel mod is +1 because you're trying to move in a positive direction, and the difference is greater than +9, then it should stop. I should have increased the velocity because this is going to take a while. And there we go, it stopped. Okay, so I think that will do it for this tutorial, because in the next video we'll handle the placement of the enemy units, the tanks and the missiles. We'll also handle the missiles launching, and we'll probably also handle the ship shooting. So it's very possible that this will only need one more video. Again, this is a very old arcade game. It was very simplistic, one of the first side-scrolling shooters. So I hope you have found this helpful. If there's any features you want to see added or you have any questions, just please leave a comment, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.